Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to this talk. I am just here to make our land acknowledgement that we are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tonga peoples, and to welcome our colleague Brian, who's going to actually introduce our wonderful speaker today. So, Brian, over to you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, you
My applause.
Thank
you. Thank you. It's great to see so many people here, and I think a few of you I haven't seen in quite a while. So thank you so much for coming out. I do want to make a confession, though. I left my written introduction in my car, which is the park a good 20 minutes away. So I've taken notes, so it won't be that chaotic. I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Gail De Kosnik here to talk to us. So I want to give you a little bit of background information. She received her BA in Modern Thought and Literature from Stanford, and then she received an MA in English Literature at Stanford as well. Her PhD is from Northwestern University in Comparative Literary Studies, and with a dissertation, and I'm just going to name her dissertation because the names are kind of introduce you to the kind of interesting nexus of all the things she's taking into in her research. Illegitimate media, race, gender, and censorship in digital remix culture. She's presently an associate professor at Berkeley. And she works for the Berkeley Center of New Media Studies and is in the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies. She's also an affiliate member of the Gender and Women's Studies and Media Studies and graduate group member Folklore, which I didn't really look up, but I'll ask you that later. She's the author of she's the author and co-editor. She's the author of one book and co-editor of another book. And I just have to scroll down here to find it. What'd you do? Get when you don't. Research, here we go. Single author book, Rogue Archives, Digital Cultural Memory and Media Fandom from MIT Press. And more recently, the co-editor of a collection of essays called Slash Identity, Hashtagging Race, Gender, Sexuality, and Nation. So I do want to give just a brief introduction to the nature of her research. I think what strikes me that's so special about her research is actually that kind of nexus. So she's definitely a media ecologist. She knows the technology. She's not kind of doing it through hearsay, which I sometimes feel like I hear cultural studies people writing about technology. You know, you kind of get that feeling. She's obviously very interested in gender and LGBTQ plus studies. And then I think she also engages in kind of a field aspect. I mean, she actually interviews a lot of people that are engaging with these archives. So when we say archives, she actually makes a distinction in a recent talk. She coins the phrase archival euphoria. So this, she kind of derives from the phrase gender euphoria, which is the kind of feeling that trans and non-binary people often get when they've kind of discovered that there's this identity out there, that there's this kind of way out of a kind of, I don't want to, this is a weird phrase, but state-controlled gender identities. I know that might sound a little heavy, but it actually makes a lot of sense when we talk about archival euphoria, because she really theorizes archives. She theorizes that most of our understanding of archives are probably from official archives that are, on the one hand, very legal, and on the other hand, kind of controlled by centralized forces. So archival euphoria, somewhat like gender euphoria, is the discovery that there are these kind of alternative archives, or she says rogue archives, but it's not unlinked to gender euphoria, because a lot of these communities centered around these archives are in fact communities of people of color or women or people of sexual minorities and gender. I'm not going to go, I have other notes here, but I think why don't we just go ahead and move to our talk by Dr. De Kosnik.
Thank you so much, Sadi and Brian, and many thanks to everyone who helped to organize my visit. Marta, Jade, and Chris, and much gratitude to all of you who have come today and to everyone who's watching the recording of this event. Hello. I will be presenting on a chapter of my forthcoming book on minority piracy, and thank you for allowing me to share my work in progress with you. This is a compressed version of one of the chapters. This is a 1903 color lithograph by John Fullylove of the interior of the Bodleian Library at Oxford University, where I spent one term during my junior year before running away from the rain very quickly back to California. Since I'm talking about a concept called the general library, I thought it would be nice to open with an image of a traditional library of printed books. I'm going to end this presentation with a very different image, very different library. The book that I'm currently writing on piracy draws on 60 interviews conducted by myself and my graduate student researchers with people who self-identified as media fans and pirates. Many of our interviewees were people of color, LGBTQ+, and or women, and I was struck by the profundity and intensity with which they spoke about their pirate practices. This book explores the deep importance that piracy holds for minoritarian peoples in the US and the ways in which the much derided term piracy stands in for or covers crucial activities for minorities such as self-making, political performance, imagining futurity, cultural archiving, and in this chapter, survival. I begin with my concept of narratives of access. I argue that the hegemonic narrative of access in the US, which is the story of access promoted by official institutions such as the government, schools, and corporations, and is encoded into the norms of everyday life, tells us that people who want to access culture, information, and media should only use authorized mechanisms. They should pay bookstores or cinemas or cable companies or streaming platforms or video game companies or other retailers, or they should use ad-supported social media platforms or podcasts or television networks and radio networks, or they should borrow from libraries. Sharing cultural texts among friends or family is often, although not always, acceptable within this hegemonic narrative of access in America. Sharing with a wider network, however, such as peer-to-peer file sharing via the internet, is unacceptable according to this narrative, as are all other illicit means of accessing texts. The interviewees I will cite in this chapter relate narratives of access that depart from and counter the hegemonic one. Their narratives hold up unauthorized access mechanisms as vital, crucial infrastructure. So the first interviewee I'm going to be citing is Aaliyah, and I allow all interviewees to identify however they wish. So when you see their adjectives on the screen, those are adjectives they chose for themselves. In our interview, Aaliyah said, "I pirate all my textbooks. STEM textbooks are ridiculous in terms of price." I asked, "So where do you get them from?" Aaliyah replied, "There's this website called GenLib. It's from the Russians." I was confused. I had never heard of GenLib. I asked her to spell it, G-E-N. Aaliyah answered, "Yeah, it's like General Library. Everyone in STEM knows it. It actually has a longer URL, but everyone calls it GenLib." The website Aaliyah was talking about was actually LibGen, which stands for Library Genesis, a famous shadow library that originated in the Soviet Union when the circulation of information was severely restricted. It still is in Russia. And LibGen today is a thriving global resource of pirated texts. But I don't think of Aaliyah's mistakenly calling LibGen GenLib and glossing that as the general library as a mistake. Rather, I find Aaliyah's misnomer to be a very suitable name for the entire pirate ecosystem. I now use the term general library to refer to the whole pirate network, inclusive of all culture, media, and information available via illicit mechanisms. So this is, I just wanted to show some of the archives, some of the shadow archives that you will find within the general library, like Library Genesis or LibGen, which Aaliyah sort of referred to, the very famous Sci-Hub, academia.edu, Scribd, and of course Google Drive, which many college instructors use to share texts with their students and with one another. So Aaliyah said, now that I've thought about it, I see piracy almost as a survival mechanism. And you know, when it's these big companies who prey on consumers that I'm pirating from, I don't really feel like I'm obligated to pay them. I see piracy as survival. I'm just like, it makes sense, especially for science. I'm like, come on, we're science majors. Why charge scientists money for textbooks who are going to make no money? So much money required just to learn something that makes no money. And science is like mostly to better the world. It's not like we're trying to create more carbon. Joe Caragnas, in his book on shadow libraries, says academic piracy brings a contradiction in the academic project into sharp relief, universalist in principle and unequal in practice. What he means, and this is a very badly drawn graph, so forgive my lack of digital drawing skill. What he means is that since the 1980s till today, state funding for higher education has gone way down. Meanwhile, student tuition fees and expenses have gone way up. And the difference between the costs that students have to bear and the aid that the government is willing to give them creates what I call a resource gap, experienced by many non-wealthy students, most of our non-wealthy students are ethnic minorities. So at the same time that this has been happening, this resource gap has been created, digital technology has become increasingly robust and widely available. And students are using that digital technology to close the resource gap. So piracy helps close the gap. Okay. Aaliyah states that she pirates in order to survive, that is, to close the resource gap that stands between her and her goal of earning a college degree and one day going on to graduate school and eventually becoming a scientific researcher. Her equation of her academic text piracy with survival calls to mind the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Not so much in the sense that her resource gap constitutes a threat to her right to life, liberty, and the security of her person, but rather in the sense that her resource gap threatens her right to science and culture. Article 27 states everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. The second thing Article 27 says is that everyone has the right to the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author. All articles of the UN Declaration of Human Rights must be interpreted, elaborated on, and translated into laws in order to actually safeguard people's rights. And let me note that the second part of Article 27, which concerns authors' protections, has been interpreted and implemented far, far more than the first part. But one scholar who has done a great deal of interpretation of the first part of Article 27 is Pakistani sociologist Farida Shahid, former UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. And she writes this about the right to science and culture. The link between the right to science and the right to culture can be further understood with regard to people's ability to aspire. A growing body of literature suggests that the ability to aspire, namely to conceive of a better future that is not only desirable but attainable, is an important cultural capability that needs to be supported and developed, especially among the marginalized and vulnerable. Through the lens provided by Shahid, we can view Aaliyah's claim that piracy is survival to mean that she needs to pirate textbooks in order to maintain her humanity. Through piracy, Aaliyah can aspire to higher education and beyond that, to meaningful work, secure income, and a fulfilling life. Through piracy, her sense of herself as a person, with a right to strive to improve her position, survives. Let's now turn to a couple of other interviewees. Subversive, who began pirating music as a teenager, told me, piracy was pure access for me. I didn't think of it as piracy. I knew I wasn't paying for it, but I was poor, and my consciousness was like, everything needs to get destroyed. And I was angry and mad about being poor. I loved it, meaning pirating music. I was like, I'm not gonna buy this album. It's all here online, and all I have to do is search for it. I'm gonna get it that way. I asked, so your feelings were positive? And Subversive said, very positive. Yeah, it was the way I accessed it. I loved that it was free. I would flaunt that it was free. I understood what equity was. I was thinking about the fact that I love music. I'm an amazing fan. I would be an amazing supportive person if I could, but I can't, literally just because of money. So why should I be kept out of those spaces? Derek said, I guess I justify pirating media with the we should have access to culture type arguments. The feeling of finally having access through piracy just really opened up my eyes to how gated off our world is monetarily. Being able to be like, oh, I want to participate in that conversation about this movie or that. We could have different forms and functions. This is still Derek. We could have different forms and functions that we could implement economically, politically, socially, that wouldn't bar people from participating in their own cultures. The pirate practices to which Subversive and Derek refer in these quotes is not piracy of academic materials, but piracy of a much broader range of culture, media, and information. So here are just some other archives you will find in the general library besides ones of academic texts. Most people have at least heard of the Pirate Bay, which sadly, since the prosecutions, is not what it used to be. Easy TV is a gigantic television torrent tracker. This is a private torrent tracker of both film and television, but also video game software that I won't name. YouTube is a tremendous archive of pirated resources. And again, Google Drive, which is, many art professors have told me they live and die by sharing video art through Google Drive. Okay, so I will now share a few more examples of how interviewees discussed using piracy to close their resource gap. We've already looked at cases of minority piracy for survival, that was Aaliyah's case, and minority piracy for cultural participation, as Subversive and Derek told us. So now the next interviewee will discuss minority piracy for education. BIPOC NB says, my father was the first person that exposed me to pirated media. From my understanding of how he lives and what communities he runs through, I'm almost certain he was getting pirated VHS tapes and DVDs from other circles of Afro-Latinx people in Orlando, where he grew up because he's a Black Puerto Rican. So he was running in a community that was Black, Indigenous, Latinx, breakdancers, hip hop culture, and he's a fireman. So I think it was this combination of his homies from his neighborhood and firemen, and they have like a lot of overlapping identities. And so that's where he got his media. And this is still BIPOC NB talking. Now that I'm thinking more about my dad, he's also a neuroemergent, neurodivergent man who never finished college and has like learning disabilities, a hard time reading, dyslexia. And so I think TV or media for him is where he gets his like education and feeling of growth and feeling that he's living and engaging. So when I say that okay, that was the end of BIPOC NB's quote. So when I say that some minorities pirate for education, I don't only mean formal education like in Aaliyah's case, but informal education. Education in the sense of self-development and feeling, as BIPOC NB says, one is growing and living and engaging, especially for people with disabilities who don't thrive in many educational institutions. Piracy offers passageways to knowledge acquisition and its attendant positive affects and effects. Also, in BIPOC NB's description of her father using media piracy to engage with those around him, we find an echo of Subversive's and Derek's emphasis on piracy for cultural participation. Next, we'll hear from another of my interviewees about minority piracy for life-saving cultural content. So this is from my interview with Gilberto. I asked, do you have any pirate stories from high school, anything you ever downloaded? Gilberto said, girl, come on. I wouldn't call it pirating, I would call it access. I needed music, you know what I'm saying? Like, I needed music. Now I pay for music, but as a child, I was definitely downloading music. I started downloading talks, podcasts, I was like, oh my God, there's so much you could do with this method. That was so cool, but yeah, that was just access for me. Piracy was the only way I could engage with really life-saving material. Like music, literature, podcasts, all that stuff makes me deeply introspective and allows me to think of myself. That's life-saving. I asked, how do you mean life-saving? Gilberto said, I knew that the media and literature that I was being forced to filter my life through actually were like destroying me. As much as I say I was existentially confused as a kid, I really mean I was depressed. Like, I was internalizing so much of the ugliness around me and had no outlet for that. And so I think that the virtual really did provide the space for me to admit to myself, firstly, that my immediate surroundings could not sustain me, and that there was something else that could. And of course, I longed for that content. All right, Gilberto says life-saving again in relation to piracy giving him life-saving forms of connection. Gilberto told me about pirating Beyonce's 2016 visual album, Lemonade, and watching it with his mother. He said, the last larger pirate thing that I can remember was downloading Lemonade. Like when Lemonade came out, it was not on Spotify. Up until recently, it was 5 years without Lemonade. And I was like, I need to listen to this. Like, Lemonade is a freaking work of art. I need to listen to it at least once a month. So I downloaded it like illegally or whatever. But it was life-saving information. It was poetry. I showed Lemonade, meaning the film, to my mother. That was truly life-saving. And I asked how that was. Oops, sorry. Okay, we could do it this way too. All right. Gilberto said, the things around me just don't work for me. I think I saw how a lot of things also didn't work for my mother, and how my mother would just deal with that or didn't. My mother is like literally an amazing human being. She's a Cancer, so she's just like a feeler. Her emotional depth is out of this world. But one of the things that kind of really scares me is that my mother's anger knows no bottom. It's just huge. And like everything that the world couldn't sustain would just come out through her anger. This anger is also what makes her sick, what makes her super anxious, what makes her act violently. So seeing Lemonade for her actually was, Lemonade was able to reflect that inner experience that she had that had no language for her yet, or no public language, or no language that allowed us both to be in that space and kind of look at each other in the eyes, even while not looking at each other. I mean, I remember me sitting on the sofa and her sitting on a chair and us watching Lemonade and her knowing exactly what I was doing and us almost looking each other in the eye. And I asked, looking each other in the eye out of the side of your eye while both looking at the screen? And Gilberto said, yeah. And my mom has a very limited understanding of English, so the visual was doing a lot. The music was doing a lot. Like when Beyonce is embodying Ocean, Ocean is the Yoruba goddess of love, sensuality, and water, and she opens the door and the water comes out, you know, that spoke to my mother. That's a language my mother understood. So, okay. So now we'll talk about minority piracy for cultural survival. Back to BIPOC Envy. They said, all my dad's brothers were pirating films just like him. They were all in that culture of the sacred piracy. I said, did you say that was a culture of sacred piracy? BIPOC Envy said, I'm a person who finds a lot of things sacred. I guess one of my fandoms or set of things I really admire are these subversive acts that are actually acts of resilience. And I think if I make it more ancestral, we can form a lineage of pirates. My family's from Puerto Rico, and half of them are Black Puerto Ricans and Indigenous Puerto Ricans, and we're also Spanish, we're white. And in Afro-Caribbean culture, and Puerto Rico as a colonized place, there was this practice called bomba that is still present today. Black folks on plantations who were in incarceration, in captivity, and chattel slavery were drumming to plan revolt and to plan escape. It was like bird calling and saying, we're still here. Are y'all still over there? And you could hear it across the entire island. And so during this period, drumming was made illegal at night by the Spanish. Folks are and were too bad not to do anything. And so I see my family in that arc of still holding this sacred subversiveness or sacred pirating or like this compulsion, is that the word, to be sneaky. So I respect it and I honor it. That's how I would read our family's piracy in an intergenerational or ancestral context. All right, that's the end of the BIPOC Envy quote. Now, cultural survival usually connotes oppressed people's efforts to preserve traditional cultural practices, but I argue that an equally important meaning of cultural survival is that marginalized people need culture, media, and information, contemporary as well as traditional, to survive. My interviewees achieved survival through culture. Jose Esteban Munoz writes, Jean-Michel Basquiat's images strategize survival and imagines assertions of self in a cultural sphere that is structured to deny visibility to such bodies. In other words, culture that speaks to minorities, that enables them to strategize survival, is invaluable. Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism focuses on the state's withdrawal from the uneven expansion of economic opportunity, social norms, and legal rights that motored so much post-war optimism for democratic access to the good life. Here, Berlant is describing the creation of the resource gap with which Aaliyah and many other non-wealthy minorities must reckon. Berlant writes, discussions about the contours and contents of the shared historical present are therefore always profoundly political ones, insofar as they are about what forces should be considered responsible and what crises urgent in our adjudication of survival strategies and conceptions of a better life than what the metric of survival can apply. I think what Berlant means here is that our adjudications of what survival strategies are okay or not okay, good or bad, ethical or unethical, align with whatever the prevailing political positions of the times are, of which there is no better demonstration than the fact that cultural access is judged differently depending on who is doing the access and how the access is happening, and what kind of culture is being accessed. Like some acts of unauthorized access, such as the looting of high-end televisions during riots, are widely regarded as not political, in the words of Evan Calder Williams, who wrote a book called In Defense of Looting. These acts of access are narrativized as reprehensible and unjustifiable theft. But Berlant would say that that very label of not political is a political adjudication of different people's survival strategies. These are photos of the London Rebellion of 2011, by the way. Okay, I'm now going to turn to examples from literature, cinema, and journalism of minority piracy for cultural survival. So this is a novel that is very meaningful and important to me, and it was written by the brilliant Professor Fred Daguiar, who is a member of your esteemed faculty. The Longest Memory takes place on a Virginia plantation at the turn of the 19th century. I'm going to read an excerpt from chapter 8 titled Cook, narrated by a slave woman who works as the cook in the master's house. She has a young son, Chapel, who comes to the house with her, and he's supposed to help her cook, but he's gone missing. All my life, 2 pots are never empty. One is in the master's kitchen. The other is my own. I sometimes take from one to fill the other. Or after the sight of the first one all day, I can hardly face the second. The 2 pots are never empty. Okay, we'll go to the next excerpt, which is a little later in the chapter. She's been calling for Chapel. He hasn't responded, so she goes looking for him in other rooms in the master's house. She says, then I hear a voice that is my son's and not my son's. It comes from the room where the master keeps his books, a room even I have not dared enter. The door is pushed to the point of being closed. I put my ear to the crack and hear my son's voice speaking as I have never heard it before. He sounds as if he is standing at a pulpit, or like the master sounds when he says prayers to the whole plantation at Christmas. I put my eyes to the crack and see Lydia, that's the master's daughter, the darling of the house, reclined in her chair with her eyes shut. The voice of my son still sounds loud and clear. I tilt my head a fraction to the left and see that he is sitting opposite her with a book in his hands, reading. Chapel reading. Chapel speaking, not from memory, but lifting words from a book with his eyes. My Chapel. So the cook steals food from the master's pot for her own pot, and in that way survives. And her son steals forbidden knowledge from the master's library. He steals literacy, using books that he is forbidden to access. And he also steals time with the master's daughter, who teaches him to read even though she is forbidden to do so. In this way, Chapel thrives and becomes an intelligent and courageous person who is later punished for attempting to run away, a brutal punishment which results in his death. But while he lives, his book piracy, his looting of literacy, means that he attains education, personal growth, and interpersonal connection, and claims his human right to science and culture. All right, next we're gonna show a little clip from Hidden Figures, 2016 film. Okay, this is a scene in which Dorothy Vaughan, a NASA scientist and mathematician played by Octavia Spencer, goes to the library looking for a particular book because computers have just been introduced to her workplace. So she's looking for a book on the programming language Fortran.
We don't want any trouble in here.
Oh, I'm not here for any trouble, ma'am.
What are you here for?
A book.
There are books in the colored section.
It doesn't have what I'm looking for.
Well, that's just the way it is.
All right, you know better.
Hands off my boys.
Don't touch them. You know, let's say. Separate and equal are two different things. Just cause it's the way doesn't make it right. Understand? Yes, you act right, you all right. That's the circle. Stay. Yes, mom. So I pay taxes. The taxes pay for everything in that library. It takes something I already paid. Fortran is a new and exciting language used by programmers to communicate with computers. It is exciting as it is the way of the future. All right, everybody smile.
Okay. I consider both Dorothy's purloining of the library book and Chapel's pirating and looting knowledge from the master's library to be acts of minority piracy for survival. Chapel and Dorothy reject the restrictions of private and public libraries, respectively, and choose to treat those libraries as if they were part of the general library, the library that makes all culture, information, and media available to all. My next example is a historical one, an actual historical couple, Mildred and Richard Loving. Richard, a white man, and Mildred, a Black and Indigenous Rappahannock woman, married in Washington, D.C. in 1958 and attempted to live together in their hometown in Virginia, where miscegenation, that is interracial marriage, was illegal. They were arrested and forced to live outside the state, and their lawsuit, Loving versus Virginia, became a Supreme Court case whose verdict in favor of the Lovings made interracial marriage legal throughout the U.S. in 1967. Life magazine did a spread on the Lovings in 1965, 2 years before the Supreme Court ruled on their case. It included photographs by Gray Villette of their daily life together, including this one of them watching a comedy on television in their living room. Mildred sitting on their sofa, Richard lying on the sofa with his head in Mildred's lap, conscious of the photographer's presence. Richard keeps his shoes on, which I assume he wouldn't have done if not for Gray Villette being there. I consider this quotidian activity by these two people at this time to be an act of minority piracy for survival. What they are looting or stealing or illicitly accessing is not the television set itself, which I presume they purchased with Richard's wages, but the human right to enjoy culture together. Since at this time their marriage was not recognized by a number of states, this performance of everyday married life, of relaxing in front of the TV at the end of the day, was illegal in those states, including their home state of Virginia. In the performance of their wedded intimacy, they assert to the readers of Life magazine that they insist on their right to access and experience culture as a married couple. For the fictional and historical people in these examples, as well as for the interviewees whom I cited, cultural texts and experiences are not necessarily abundant, easy to access resources, yet they are necessary resources of which all Americans must gain possession in order to aspire to most versions of the increasingly unattainable good life. Without culture, minorities will not die, but they will not be fully alive, and they will not be fully human. And so we get to one of the central points of this chapter, which is that underlying aversions to minority piracy is a wish for non-wealthy minorities not to be fully alive or fully human, a wish for them to live in a state of what Giorgio Agamben calls bare life. Agamben defines bare life as an abject state of human living, in which a human exists but is not regarded as sacred, in which a human can be killed but not sacrificed. In other words, a person who occupies the category of bare life is a person without the status of personhood, a person who, if they were killed, would not be considered to have been the victim of a murder. Anything can be done to bare life, including cultural and informational deprivation. Skipping some parts, okay. The hegemonic access narrative tells Americans that anyone who cannot pay for culture can still have culture via a legal free tier of resources, which includes ad-supported media and public libraries, even though, by the way, ads are not free. We pay for ads with our attention, but still. However, the free tier is not comprehensive and often does not include the most current leading edge texts. Also, libraries lend digital and physical copies of texts to one patron at a time, so scarcity is built in to authorized library use. And a patron's access expires when they return the copy, so long-term ownership is not built in to authorized library use. In other words, in an age of hyper-techno-capitalism, when knowledge work dominates the middle and top echelons of the American economy and society, when, as Mark Does writes, quote, the uses and appropriations of media penetrate all aspects of contemporary life, and life is lived in rather than with media. In our reality, the free tier is insufficient for under-resourced minorities because it does not close the resource gap. In contrast to the free tier, the general library gives internet users of all demographics nearly unlimited access to nearly unlimited content, which when they download the content, they can retain for as long as they wish. The aim of the free tier is boundedness. The aim of the general library is boundlessness. My husband, Benjamin De Kosnik, who is familiar with my framework of the general library, sometimes personifies it by saying, if you can't find something you need, go to the general's library and ask the general's niece, Alexandra, for it. He is referring to Alexandra Elbakian, founder of Sci-Hub. What Benjamin means is that the general and his niece have everything and anything you seek, and they will be happy to give you, not lend you, a copy. Patrons of the general library must develop knowledge, skill, will, and effort in order to use it. And in developing this knowledge, skill, will, and effort, they acquire what I call technological privilege. I have previously written about the technological privilege of San Francisco tech workers, but minority technological privilege is different. It is tech privilege exercised from below. Non-wealthy minorities use tech privilege to close their resource gaps. When people who may otherwise lack many kinds of privilege, financial, racial, gendered, sexual, social, cultural privilege, and so on, when these people who lack privilege gain technological privilege, they then can try to leverage their tech privilege into those other forms of privilege. Historically, minorities have been condemned for using technological privilege to close their resource gaps and aspire to the good life. For example, slaves who learned to read and write, like Chapel in The Longest Memory. People of color who attained levels of education banned to them by segregation laws, like Dorothy Vaughan in Hidden Figures. The Lovings, who consciously performed their domestic life for mass media with mass media, and thereby flouted anti-miscegenation laws. Looters who have stolen expensive televisions during riots and rebellions. All of these minorities broke laws and conventions and social and cultural norms when they used or gained tech privilege in order to survive. The narrative spun around their access painted them as criminals. I'm just going to show a few more examples about groups that I have written about before, who also have, when they have used tech privilege, have had that used against them. So another example is Asian Americans who excel in STEM and other forms of knowledge work who are subjected to techno-orientalist tropes that is regarded as robots or automatons and stereotyped as model minorities, which dehumanizes them and pits them both against whites and other minorities and prevents them from gaining acceptance as full human beings in American society and culture, even as Asian Americans fill crucial jobs in STEM fields. I've also written about African Americans who invented digital remix culture using the first digital samplers in the 1980s, who were subjected to censorship, lawsuits, and heavily racialized tropes of violent thuggery, even as they launched hip hop, currently one of the most dominant global cultural forms. And I've also written about queer women and girls who founded the earliest transformative internet fan communities, who were derided and dismissed as non-normative, fringe, and pathological, even as they invented the genres of online fan creativity that dominate digital culture today. Arlie Hochschild writes of the members of the Tea Party movement. You'll remember that movement. It preceded the alt-right. The right, this is a quote from Hochschild, the right-wingers wanted to aim their indignation down at the poor slackers, some of whom were jumping the line. That is, conservative, mostly white Americans deeply resent non-wealthy minorities who rely on state funding to get ahead, who jump ahead of them in the line for the good life. It seems to these conservative Americans that these minorities are unjustly getting better chances at living the increasingly elusive American dream, unjustly because of handouts like government aid, even though this aid is, as we have seen, insufficient for recipients' needs, but also unjustly, I argue, because some non-wealthy minorities in the US acquire and deploy technological privilege to survive. The conservative hatred of minorities in this country, in other words, is not only about the assistance that minorities get, but the assistance they don't get. Their resource gaps, which stand between what the government is willing to do to help them and what they need to do in order to actually live as full human beings in the society and to make it into the middle class or higher. I claim, based on my qualitative data and the examples from cultural texts, which I have cited here, that inherent in the hegemonic narrative of access in America are two particular manifestations of racism and classism. One is the gatekeeping of culture, media, and information so that non-wealthy minorities cannot readily access all of what they want and need. And the second is resentment and shaming of non-wealthy minorities who gain and wield tech privilege in order to close their resource gaps and get ahead. In other words, we can see that anti-minority structures and feelings in the US have technological, or rather anti-technological, dimensions. There exists an often unspoken but popular and long-running belief among dominant groups that non-wealthy minorities should not hack the techno-capitalist system with know-how. Minorities who lack financial resources in America are supposed to be human resources. To use a Heideggerian term, they are supposed to be the standing reserves of labor, whether physical, informational, emotional, or cultural, that dominant groups can use at will. Minorities are not supposed to use technological know-how, they are supposed to be the technologies. That is, the tools through which wealthy and white Americans level up. So, okay. Let's go to counter-hegemonic narratives of access. In the 21st century and at many earlier points in US history, minorities have found that tech privilege can be their bridge between resource impoverishment and resource abundance. Contemporary minority pirates have only to withstand the shaming to which the hegemonic narrative of access subjects them. They must tolerate society's widespread condemnation of piracy and the sting of such labels as pirate, looter, cheater, criminal, to not allow themselves to feel embarrassed about fighting against the state of deprivation, the state of bare life, imposed on them by race-classed structures and systems. My interviewees explain several ways that they combat the internalization of these derogatory perceptions of their bids for survival. In other words, they tell counter-hegemonic narratives about their access. In my view, the most effective of these narratives was voiced by Aaliyah, who reframed her plundering of the pirate network for academic materials as patronage of an infrastructural marvel that has proven to be necessary for many under-resourced people around the globe, including American minorities, who seek the means to survive as humans with full rights, and that is the general library. Thank you so much. I said I would conclude with a picture of a very different library. So this is an image that appeared in Science Magazine in 2016. This is global activity in Sci-Hub at that time. And it appeared in an article titled, "Who's Downloading Pirated Papers? Everyone." Right, cool.
You don't have one of those mics, do we? Or we just, no, I don't think we need one. Okay, let's be sure to speak loudly because I think that's what's recording you, so, I'd like to open us up to some the Q&A session. I'd like to introduce the Q&A session. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
Well, first, I had no idea I was using pirated libraries. When you put academia and scribe D up there, I'm going, because you pay for those.
You can,
I
yeah.
mean, I do.
Yeah.
But it never occurred to me that the materials were pirated. But my real question is, why you left out for once? I mean, I came here from Arkansas, where
Right,
I've never seen cultural deprivation like that.
right.
I mean, people who had never seen a city, never seen a movie, I mean, not a movie, never seen a museum, never
Yeah.
seen, gone to a concert, who couldn't understand my English.
Yeah,
And so,
right.
would it make a different story? The two students I've had as honor students here who I couldn't pull across the line were both from poor white backgrounds.
Yeah,
And I couldn't convince them that you couldn't cite the astrology things as a scholarly resource in your paper and things like that. I mean, where there was such a huge cultural gap.
yeah.
And so I'm surprised that that entire, which is going to be a fairly large population, has just disappeared from your research.
Well, those members of our society are part of Hochschild's research. Those are the groups that Hochschild interviewed. So I do think, while I didn't happen to come across people from this demographic in my own interviewing, I do sort of rely on Hochschild's research that shows that, as we know, as we've known, in this country since Reconstruction, unfortunately, racism puts a divide between poor whites and poor Black and brown and Asian people. And that discourse, that racist discourse, calls upon poor whites to weaponize their race against poor members of other groups. So there is, even though there is so much commonality in material and also, these more immaterial, spiritual, educational ways that you're talking about, part of what I'm saying about racist and classist discourses and mechanism structures in this country is that there is that divide between minorities and whites.
It just would be interesting to know whether kids in Arkansas, whether they do the same practices of piracy, or whether whether there's an actual cultural difference there.
Yeah. I mean, also there is in our universities, in American universities, most of the people who are receiving aid are ethnic minorities too. So poor whites are a bit left out of that system perhaps. And that's an interesting question as well, because where are minorities getting their technological privilege? They're getting it at college, So if poor whites are sort of not in that same pipeline to college, then perhaps technological privilege is something that is more absent for them. But I agree, this would be a really interesting, I'd love to talk to you about this more. I think this is a really interesting avenue for research.
Okay.
Hi, this is so thrilling. I love this talk, and I think you're doing a similar move to what you did in Rogue Archives. What I found so inspiring there is that you took this dominant media studies discourse about the sort of like the heroic, masculinist, archivist online, and you reveal that actually it's really more about like feminized forms of labor, of maintenance and care, and that's been really inspiring to me, and I know at least some of the grad students here in the room as well. With this project, I guess my question is, I think that there's two major dominant discourses in internet studies that you're pushing against, and I wanted you to maybe talk about that a little bit. On one hand, there's the old-fashioned kind of California ideology that like information wants to be free, right? So we have things like Sci-Hub. There's an argument for Sci-Hub that it's like this is just the nature of information, and this has led to all kinds of troubling things, and most recently the rise of generative AI. So the master's library or the general library is one that can claim everything and access everything, right? And so I think you're pushing against that in a really interesting way. So I wanted to hear a bit about that.
Yeah.
But also on the other side of that is this discourse around like the right to privacy or the control of creative production. So this is like the SAG-AFTRA strike and everything else. These discourses that I think generative AI is really bringing up is around like who has rights to control the production of their creative. And Beyonce is a good example of somebody who's really tried to maintain control over her creative production. But I guess, I'm really interested in how you're navigating discourses in this project and what your thoughts are.
Thank you so much for that. I am going to think harder about both of those. So these will be very off-the-cuff answers. I mean, for sure, I push against California ideology because it is one of those discourses that claims that technological virtuosity, I mean, does it claim this? It's implicit in California ideology, which is a paper that came out in the not even, during Web 1.0, but before Web 1.0, that said that, my God, this thing is being built called Silicon Valley in Northern California, where all anyone wants to talk about is these new technologies that these companies are building on the back of venture capital. And this is problematic, So the authors of California Ideology, like, very quickly sussed out the problem with big tech, which is that it is too homogeneous. It was going to be all the same people determining the future, and that was going to be bad for everybody else, So I do indeed want to introduce other kinds of bodies into the space of technological virtuosity, and also to just claim, what is the reality of use of these technologies? It's not, big tech hardly determines the internet. They determine the most visible parts of the internet, but there are many, many, many parts of the internet that are occupied by all the rest, all the rest of us. And so my attention is on those sections, not on sort of, not as much on what big tech says it's doing or claims to be doing or performs on the internet. And I think the second part of what you're saying, pushing back on that, control of creative production is my whole bag. I mean, that's my whole life. So indeed, I mean, it's interesting you say Beyonce. I think of Beyonce as a pirate. Anyone who has seen the YouTube videos that compare Beyonce's dancing to, Bob Fosse and Gwen Verdon's, like, for example, Single Ladies is borrowed from a Fosse Verdon dance called Mexican Breakfast. And she does this over and over again with Meester, with Shakira, she pirates very freely in her own work. She has evolved how she credits and gives attribution for those pirate acts, which I love. I love watching her develop as a pirate and piratical thinker. But, in the beginning, it was all just like, this is just the culture. I am making Meester famous, which was the truth. So I think that there are many interesting dimensions to ownership, authorship, and control that still have to be theorized out. But my project is not to give any answers like, here's how we should think about authorship, like how we keep going back to part 2 of Article 27. We keep thinking about authors' rights, but there's another whole part to that article in the Declaration of Human Rights, and that has to do with uses and who gets to use culture. So I'm still much more interested in that first part of that article, because all our energy has gone to part 2. And authors have a lot of rights in our culture. So I don't need to think more about authors' rights. Authors, you just do what you can, And I just want to highlight and showcase what the people are actually doing, what the users are doing. Thank you for that.
This person over here.
Hi, I'm a big fan of Rogue Archives.
Oh, thank you.
I have 2 questions. So, I found really interesting you're putting pressure on the question of the author's rights, because usually corporations just utilize that as a way of safeguarding copyright.
Mm-hmm.
When you're referring to the resource gap, I'm also interested in not only the access to media, but to infrastructure as well.
Yeah.
Because when I used to teach at the University of Puerto Rico, a lot of those students just didn't have computers.
Right.
They would do all their papers on their phones.
Yeah.
Right? So the university also becomes kind of a hub where they might have access to some technology, sometimes steal laptops. That
Sure.
maybe you can speak about that kind of resource
For sure.
gap of infrastructure.
Yeah.
And you describe a lot of these relationships, kind of like in Rogue Archive, between users and access to the artifact or the text or the object. Do they also see themselves as contributing or upholding certain practices around piracy? They see themselves, how important it is to download, and they themselves have access. But when you interviewed them, did they see themselves as providing traditions of access for other users in those communities?
Yeah, that's so great. So thank you for that. The general library is not only digital, and it never has been. The general library is an ancient practice. I remember somebody told me about this fabulous bookstore of feminist texts in Istanbul, where everybody who got a copy of a book they would consider to be feminist would just go to their university, photocopy the whole thing, and then place it on the shelf in this bookstore for other people to be able to access. And these kinds of non-digital models of sharing photocopying. You remember when course readers were,
Yeah.
is anyone that old? Like, yeah, like course readers used to be the piracy, or, making copies of your friend's course reader so you wouldn't have to pay the $45 or whatever. So I remember the story of a frat getting busted at Stanford where that frat just had files and files worth of like course materials. So, I think these are ancient practices, and you don't need a computer to participate in the general library, to donate to it, to get stuff from it. That library's been going on and on forever. But yeah, for sure, I think there is, what you're talking about is the free rider problem, which theorists of file sharing do think about, which is like, if everybody just downloaded from the internet, then there'd be nothing, because everybody would just be taking and nobody would be sharing. So indeed, there are a lot of sites in the general library. Scribd is one of them, actually, that if you're on the free tier, you have to pay for using Scribd by uploading. So you can't just download stuff. Like, you can't just take from the general library. You have to put into the general library in order to take from it. A lot of private torrent trackers have ratio requirements. So your ratio cannot be like, I downloaded, 3 terabytes worth of stuff and I uploaded 350 megs worth of stuff. Like, no, your ratio has to be relatively in balance. Like, you can download more than you upload, but not by much. Or at some sites, you have to be way above. You have to share a lot more than you take. So these are, I would say, norms in the general library, but I also think Alexandra Elbakian is not interested in these norms. Some sections of the general library are way more relaxed than others about this. About citizenship, you could say, like the rules of belonging. I think that is because Sci-Hub is just so big. You will always find seeders in Sci-Hub, so you don't need to worry about it. But smaller and I would say safer, very safe private communities of piracy will have all kinds of rules around ratio. I also just wanted to, we may not have time, it's 1 o'clock, but I also have other projects I could talk about, just so you know. We don't have to, but there's other stuff.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I think it is really intriguing, but I want to push back a little bit against the idea that this is all good or that there's no cost to it.
Sure.
And I think Danny already alluded to part of this, so there's the minority piracy, but right now we also have a major project of majority in AI, and we're seeing that that's causing major problems. So I think
totally
we want to hear exactly how we distinguish that, and how we distinguish the opinions of some interviewees who seem very young, that don't maybe yet have a stake in this. They haven't written the book or produced music or tried to break into the film or music industry and realize how hard that is.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of, I'm very, very suspicious of the idea that when things go for free, they're actually free. And
right.
I think there has been a lot of research on that, for example, in the context of credit cards and all of these free benefits that we get, which it turns out it is actually the less privileged credit card holders who end up paying for this. And I think this is also happening here. I can only judge this. I don't know the music and film industries as well, but in academia, it's perfectly obvious. I mean, we can afford to have our work plagiarized. And I've seen my work sort of pirated, on Russian and French, Francophone websites, and I have little ferrets that alert me to that. And it doesn't really matter, because I don't make that much money off my books anyway. And it doesn't matter because I have an income. But for anybody who needs to live off of their writing, no, that is not good.
Right.
And that actually deprivileges precisely the people who don't have a position at a state or private university.
Yeah, writers like the members of the WGA who just went on strike for not getting paid by their studios. So
even for us, I think part of the reason that a lot of academic books are so expensive is that precisely, and they sell very small numbers because everybody can just, pirate them and put them on their password protected course websites. And nobody can really come after them because it's very difficult to ascertain that there has actually been a copyright violation and things like that. And yeah, we may feel okay about that as instructors because we save our students money. But let's not kid ourselves into thinking that there isn't a cost somewhere.
Yeah.
And I kind of, that's sort of what interests me here too. Yeah, it's great for a bunch of 20-year-olds to think that this is their access and this is their privilege. And I welcome that. But I think sort of taking a step back,
Yeah.
there is a cost to this.
Yeah.
And
For sure.
I'd like to hear.
For sure. I mean, over and over again, the sort of argument against piracy is what about the artists? But as we have seen in the last year, the artists went on strike because they were not getting paid for their work. The artists were never getting paid by the studios. It didn't matter how much money the studios made, and the studios and networks, their bar graph of revenue has only gone up since digital technology was invented. So the lie around piracy undercutting revenues is just that. It is fiction. And, the same studios that were crying about downloading music or movies or whatnot, their revenues were going up, and the artists' income was going down and down and down. So, I mean, our system, the larger ecology of media, is not taking care of the artists. And it's taking care of artists much worse than like 1990, like 1990 artists could sign a big record deal or medium record deal and make money off of that record deal. And today Spotify pays artists like 5 cents for every 20 million downloads. I mean, it's really criminal what has happened to artists. So I do not think it is other users of culture that have undermined artists' income. I think it is 100% the publishers, the studios, the networks, the music labels. It is 100% media corporations that have hurt artists' bottom line. In fact, when it comes to academic publishing, there was quite a famous piece written in, I think 1991 or something, called A Subversive Proposal, that said, and this was on Usenet. So again, this was like just at the cusp of the World Wide Web getting launched, but mostly that web wasn't there yet. And an academic from Princeton said, great, we have computers. Now we have no publishing costs. Let's just publish. Let's just publish scholarship online, because we have incomes, like you said. So we don't need royalties. Let's just make a system. Today we call that open access publishing. But what is amazing is that while the cost of publishing online have gone down, they could almost go to nothing, the costs of academic publishing have gone way, way up. Publishers are charging more money of libraries than ever before. Libraries are running out of money. They cannot subscribe to all of these journals anymore. And why is that? So my stance on the artist and the author is that it is not because of piracy that they're not getting paid. I mean, because of piracy, they're getting read and, seen and heard, which is great. But it is not pirates that are taking money out of artists' mouth. Because of digital technology, money could have flown very differently to artists. Very easily, like Aaron Swartz's proposal was, put a tax on all bandwidth. All bandwidth, if you pay for the internet, a portion of that tax gets divided among all of the artists and authors you downloaded. It just gets farmed out to them like royalty checks. So we could have structured this very differently, but
open
we
access
didn't.
is not free. I mean,
But it's much less expensive.
And they're looking for funding all of the time
Yes.
to cover their costs. So somebody pays for open access.
If the libraries didn't have to pay publishers all of their very increased prices, they would have tons of money to pay for open access, which is relatively inexpensive compared to Sage or compared to Elsevier.
On the editor side, I've struggled with Palgrave Macmillan and with Routledge about the prices they pay for the last 15 years. And what they will tell you is that it's not even the number of copies that they sell, but it's the production. I mean, it still has to be edited. It still has to be laid out in copy. And journals that are open access have to pay somebody to do that. So that's the cost that they are charging for. And it's the the presses that can afford to make their books cheap are the ones that have endowments in academia. So University of Chicago Press, sure, they can charge $25 for your book because they have a huge endowment. Harvard University Press. But Routledge and Palgrave will tell you that we actually have to make a profit off of these, or otherwise we close down. And that's why our books cost $150, not $25, right?
I mean, that's what they say, that's what they say. I can also publish tomorrow on the internet. I mean, I could pay somebody to edit. I could, these are the things that the subversive proposal in 1991 was trying to formulate, these ways of having the editor and copy editor pipeline and formatting pipeline and not have it be a fortune. And we did not go that way as a society. But it's convenient for corporations to blame people when corporations are, they're enterprises that are they are alive to make money. Like that's their goal. So
Can I just interject with my own question?
yes.
Coming from that kind of heady early period of the internet in the 90s, when the internet first hit, piracy was the whole notion of a pirate community and the temporary autonomous zone of Hockey Bay and so forth. It's kind of what I loosely describe as like a technico-anarcho-libertarianism.
Right,
So I thought that, and this was before we had things like digital archives and the way that you're talking about. I mean, most HTML pages were just kind of hand coded and usernets and things like that. But the key term here is libertarian, which always rang as a kind of leftist thing. At least at the time, at least the way I understood it.
Or counter government.
It's definitely counter government,
right.
anti-statism, you might say, or anti-state as we. But I think with the rise of things like Twitter. And but also things like Bitcoin, I think a lot of people continue to use that kind of leftist thing, of liberatory, at least with Bitcoin.
Yeah.
I talk to people like that. And yet the whole libertarian element has been, I think, kind of co-opted by a kind of what I like to think is kind of a fringe right, but this includes Elon Musk and the entire philosophy.
Peter Thiel.
And Peter Thiel. Musk was saying when I get Twitter, it's going to be a total free-for-all of language and communication, but clearly we didn't see that. And yet he still kind of, harkens back to that kind of libertarian utopian thing. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, because I can't help but think that, these general libraries of yours still harken back to that kind of dream that we had back in the day, in which it wasn't just the California thing, but there was an actual kind of counter state, revolutionary appeal to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, Wendy Chun said that too to me about the Piracy project. She's like, all the piracy people are just like techno-libertarians.
Yeah.
And that's true. So the question about the relation to infrastructure, I think, is a good one, because I also won't defend the general library as a kind of like authored infrastructure. I'm talking about uses. I'm talking about uses and users. But in terms of who is operating these torrent trackers, or who is operating, not the Pirate Bay, because we know those people, but like who is running release teams, for instance, or who is profiting from virtual private networks? Like, to your point, Ursula, the general library is not free. You actually do have to pay quite a bit of money to use these technologies, just to use them in a safe way, for sure. So I think that question of is like a question of the internet itself. It's like, who builds the internet? Like, who's okay, we are using this park in cool ways, let's say. Like, that's my chapter, right? Of like, the users come in and they see a park and it's open and they're like, oh, thank God we can have Freaknik or whatever they're gonna have in that park. But who built that park? And for what? And what do they want to do with that park? That is a question of the whole internet, not just these pirate sites, but also every legal site, every social media site, every streaming platform. I mean, we are right to be suspicious of what are the motives. Like, I don't know if people saw Fallout. This is a great show that just premiered on Amazon Prime Video, and it's based on a hugely popular video game. Well, one of the commentaries about Fallout in the Fallout Reddit sub was, it's amazing, this person said, I hate Amazon as a corporation, but it's amazing how much anti-capitalist content they have on Prime Video. And that's true. Amazon tends to greenlight these anti-capitalist programs, these anti-capitalist shows. And the responses were like, but that's capitalism. Capitalism will try to sell you everything, including anti-capitalism. It'll sense your resistance to Amazon and it'll package that for you in a way you can you can be down with buying, you can be down with watching, you know? So we are right to be suspicious of all platforms that have standing in this world. I mean, this is why the Fediverse is important and other kinds of efforts to distribute the web, you know? I mean, the distributed web is a dream that, like the subversive proposal, this dream has been dreamed since before the web. We still need to keep fighting for that vision, but that is not the world we live in. Like right now, a lot of the general library groups are, you know, privately owned, privately run, and they profit from kids. You know, they ask for $10 a month for a VPN and they get it. So that question, I think, is very legitimate in the sense that, like, these pirates are operating for their very human reasons, as I pointed out, but they have very few choices actually about where to get their culture and information.
Luis, and then Dave.
Your answer just made me think of something that I can't quite put my finger on it, but my question has two parts. First is, can you explain a little bit more what you mean by privacy, piracy? Because I'm hearing access, borrowing, owning, using, and I don't know what it is anymore. And sampling, right? Because you're talking about like acts of imitation within cultural objects or art objects, like Beyonce's practice that you talked about earlier. All under an umbrella term of piracy. I keep stumbling over that because my question is also about public and private users and uses. So from what I understand, you're talking about private use of some kind of object that is accessible somewhere. And you began with a photograph of a painting of the library. And there's some kind of zero-sum game at play here too. That is the underfunding of public resources, which are not about ownership, but are in fact about sharing. Is what is putting pressure on this term of piracy for me. And you use the word sharing when talking about piracy, but then you said that libraries, you only get a book for a certain amount of time, so that's no good. Why? Like, why is that no good? I don't understand.
Oh, okay. Well, because you can't keep that book. Whereas
why is ownership the operative term?
Because people like to archive culture. People like to have. Do you own DVDs, or did you ever? And do you collect anything? People like to collect things. People like academics, for example, like to own copies of things so they can repeatedly refer to them. Fans like to own copies of things so they can repeatedly consume them. You know, people like to have. But not everybody, and people that use libraries don't need that, and that is their right, and that's great.
About access for certain minority groups. If ownership is what's the key.
Oh, it doesn't define. Ownership doesn't define, I would say, the goal of every pirate. Like, pirates also like to stream content and not own it. They don't need to own it always. You know, sharing happens regardless of whether the end user retains a copy of what is shared or not. But the act of sharing, I would say, is the operative term, and sharing across borders or across financial boundaries, for instance, you know, it's encoded in that term file sharing. But yeah, I mean, the ownership part is something that my interviewees appreciated because they are fans and they like to have copies of the culture that they use. But yeah, there are many pirates that only stream, for instance, and there are many people that only borrow a digital copy of a book from a library, and so they only have it for, you know, however long it takes them to read it, and they're totally fine with that. All I'm saying is that you have to admit that having two choices about how to use something, to either borrow it or to own it, is more than what the library offers, which is just to borrow it, even in the case of digital texts. So that is a difference between a library, an official library, state-supported library, and the general library.
David?
I wanted to go back to the question of that you raised, which was, I thought, very interesting about, you know, who built the park, and then also who maintains the park, right? And I was also thinking, listening to your account of piracy, about, you know, what a broader sort of Marxist point of view might be on this. And I wanted to ask you whether you thought of piracy as as kind of more a symptom or containing a kind of solution.
Mm,
What I mean by that is I was reminded of Marx's writing about the byproducts of capitalist development.
Yeah.
Producing kinds of expertise, forms of intelligence, technological skill, know-how, because the technological development of Marxism, he didn't think that was too much to be celebrated if it wasn't going to lead to
yeah,
a process that led to massive redistribution.
right.
And you could say, well, everything you're talking about in piracy is symptomatic of massive failures in terms of public good. And the solution then would be to reinvest in the public good, like libraries, make education more affordable, redistribute wealth so people can afford leisure time, get more access to culture. Access everyone should have a lot more of. Piracy seems to be a great method.
A workaround.
A workaround.
Yeah.
But is it then a kind of release valve, like Marx talked about wage increases, just a release valve to perpetuate the system?
Yeah.
It's actually still oppression.
Sure. I mean, are we all complicit with our own oppression? Yes, we are. Yeah, totally.
Right. So
Absolutely.
So there's a case in which I'm curious about this. It's a very polyvalent term, piracy, which makes it interesting to think with. But in your argument, is it leading towards some kind of dialectical opening up to some new way of understanding the internet?
Yeah.
Because at the moment, I'm wondering how that would happen.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that there is within acts of piracy and fandom, there is a truth, like the truth of how culture actually works, which is that regardless of law or money, culture is shared, culture is transformed, culture passes from hand to hand and ear to ear and eye to eye. That's the reality. And millions, hundreds of millions, 1 billion people or more live that reality every day. Or all of us, if we just forget about copyright and just the way we talk about culture and the way we mean culture, share culture, whatever. It's like culture moves, culture travels. So there is something in it that I think is even deeper than Marxism, which is like folklore, But I think what you're saying about the workaround is actually my point in this chapter, which is that the United States needs, for many reasons, post-civil rights, to uphold an image of itself as equitable and inclusive and accessible and diverse. The US culture, I mean, not the alt-right culture, but like kind of the mainstream US culture, and even some alt-righters would agree with this. It's like, in general, the US strives for equity or something, something like that. And yet everything the government has done doesn't really strive for equity and has created these huge resource gaps. So, for example, we have a lot of illegal immigration in this country where people work for less than a minimum wage to feed us. That's a workaround. That's not the way it should be, and it's not the way the government says it should be, and it's not strictly legal, and it's not legal in a lot of ways. Like, they're here illegally, that's the whole point and stuff. And so, yet we need it. We need it to feed ourselves, and we need it to maintain an image of the nation as inclusive. And piracy is like one of those performances where piracy happens because there is a gap not just in the individual student's resources, but in the nation's conception of itself and what the reality actually is. And that gap is filled by workarounds like individual, people who don't have a lot of resources finding those resources one way or another, so that they never have to confront the university and say, I cannot afford the textbooks here. So we never have those strikes, we never have those protests, because we have piracy. So what you're saying about that sort of stopgap, that is my point, is that it works like a stopgap that everybody needs, and yet those very people who found the stopgaps are condemned for it. They have to withstand that, even if it's an internalized knowledge, they have to withstand that label of pirate.
So the intervention is in kind of lifting the shame and that, which is quite right. But it's not structured. I mean, I was just thinking, just a quick example of the kind of economic difference between two sets of the term. Beyonce is a pirate, but she borrows freely, and that's very creative. But she's also a strike-breaking billionaire. So she's not the same kind of person.
Yeah, that's right.
From the bottom, though blurring those economic distinctions through one term.
Yeah, well, I didn't include Beyonce's piracy in my, you know, that my chapter on Beyonce's piracy is for some other time. So yes, she doesn't belong in this chapter, that's for sure. This is a particular subset of the pirate population. But I do think pirate artists, you know, whatever we want to call them, appropriation art or remix culture, I do think that is its own very interesting set of contradictions, precisely because what you're saying, you know, Beyonce on the one hand disregards copyright, doesn't think about it. On the other hand, of course, owns all the copyright to all her material. You know, lots of artists will say, oh yeah, I would lift records, you know, the Beatles like stole records from record companies and not record companies, but record shops. And also the Beatles listened to pirate radio, and pirate radio was the only way in Britain they could hear sort of non-classical music, you know, or something that wasn't light jazz or something like that. And from that piracy, the Beatles built a new sound. And so like many artists have these histories of stealing, like Benjamin's history of literally borrowing friends' books and not handing them back, you know, never giving them back. Roberto Bolaño talks about stealing books every time he went into a bookstore in Mexico City. Lots of writers and artists have these histories of piracy. And then when they become, you know, big, they hate pirates, they hate piracy, they hate MP3s. You know, so this is something that we see over and over again that I think is another interesting turn. Beyonce, by the way, doesn't condemn, you know, she doesn't condemn like downloading or like she's not hypocritical in that way. But I do think there's lots of interesting corners and contradictions and paradoxes within artists who appropriate. And sampling was one of those moments when you could see, wow, this is really about race. Because it was fine when it was, you know, when it's like William Burroughs doing cut-ups, like that's okay. But somehow when it's Black men and it's sound and there's, you know, and then there's rap and there's lyrics over those sounds that is about life in the hood. Suddenly that's illegal and a problem and we need to pass laws, and we passed laws against it. So there are many corners to Beyonce plus for sure.
Okay. We'll take one last question and then we're gonna thank Dr.
Okay.
But let's take one last question. Go ahead, yes, please.
Thank you. I loved your talk so much, Professor De Kosnik. And one of the things, my dad was a pirate who pirated cable television onto VHS.
Yes.
For all the people who didn't have cable TV in the hood. And
he shared.
Yeah, he shared like tapes up to the ceiling.
Yeah.
All around a whole room.
Wonderful.
It was amazing. And it was a library for the community.
Yes.
And so I just you know, I wanted to revisit that part of like, I think for him, and people that I know like that, it was an act of like sticking it to the man.
Yeah.
You know, it was it was a racial resistance.
Yes.
And I saw that kind of thread in the people, which is different, I think, from like Aaron Swartz or other people's.
Or techno-libertarians.
Or techno-libertarianism. So I just want to revisit, because I feel like that was kind of a main through line.
Thank you.
We've gotten off that topic.
Yes.
I wanted to just give you a last word on foregrounding some of that.
Yes, I think that racial resistance, thank you so much for putting it that way, I will cite you when I write that, is exactly the affect, the feeling that my interviewees were conveying. I mean, some of it was like a classist resistance, like, how can I not afford this textbook? That's insane, you know, and I'm going to do good things with this knowledge. So some of it is like, why am I so poor and I cannot afford to be at this institution? And some of it is definitely racialized in the sense that we're talking, you know, in terms of my interviewees about poor Black and brown kids growing up with very little. And you'll meet some of these interviewees again in my other chapters, so you get a fuller sense of their backgrounds. But the ways that culture plays into that poverty and all of the trauma that comes along with immigration, not speaking English, being queer in that family, in that culture, you know, all of these traumas, what they conveyed was that cultural access was paramount. paramount in those conditions. So the cultural access does come from the space of why should I be kept out, as Subversive said, or can't I belong? I'm a part of this culture. So yeah, I think that assertion of that humanity, of that equality is so key, and thank you. And I just want to say one thing about your dad and Greece, which is that after Greece's terrible financial crisis, one thing that Athens did was build a mesh net in which like one household a night would stream a movie to the rest of all of the Athenian households on the mesh net. You know, in times of real poverty, deep crisis, like profound trauma, it's amazing what pirated culture can do. It can really bond people, heal people, forge that community. So your father was doing that work, and you know, Athenians in the thick of the economic crisis also thought, okay, all time for alternate infrastructure, you know, time to use culture for us, for healing. And your dad was like, he was a builder of alternate infrastructure. So that's so great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.